everyone, and welcome to our Vice Chancellor's Reading Group at the University of Johannesburg. My name is Maria Frahm-Arp, and I'm the Executive Director of the Library at the University of Johannesburg, and we are hosting this reading group. It is my pleasure to warmly welcome Prof. Marwala, our VC at UJ, our members of council, members of the MEC and ELG, staff and students at UJ, and the friends of UJ who have joined our VC's reading group. Over the course of this year, Prof. Marwala has been discussing with us different socio-economic and political theories. And today he is going to discuss with us the book, The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. As many of you know, Popper was a philosopher, sociologist, economist who wrote in the middle of the 20th century and whose work was particularly influential and still is in disciplines like sociology, economics, and politics. And so as we are in this third wave of COVID, the question of what is an open society, I think, is more at the forefront of much of our thinking. 2 weeks ago at the University of Johannesburg, we had a conference on philosophy and COVID. And one of the key debates in this conference was, when do we take decisions for the collective good of a society? And these decisions then infringe on ideas of an open society. How much choice do people have? When do governments step in, etc.? And so, Prof. Marwala, it is a great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. And I think we are all particularly interested in hearing your understanding of Karl Popper and your summary of the open society and its enemies. Just to remind everybody in the group, sorry, Prof. Marwala, that if you have questions, please do post them in the Q&A. Prof. Marwala will give us his ideas, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask your questions or share with us some of your ideas. Please do post them in the question and answers. We won't take any live questions. Also note that the webinar is being streamed on Facebook, and you will get notification of the links to the webinar afterwards if you want to share it with friends and have other people follow. So over to you, Prof. Marwala, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you very much, Maria, for organizing this. I also would like to thank the audience for coming to discuss perhaps one of the most difficult books that I have actually read. This idea of reading is very important. As a matter of fact, in July this year, I shall be publishing a book, Lessons from the Books I Have Read. Now, the book that we are going to discuss today, as Maria has already indicated, is The Open Society and Its Enemies, and is written by Karl Popper. And those of us who are in the sciences know one of the most significant contributions of Karl Popper was the theory of falsification, that a theory cannot necessarily be proven right. It can only be falsified. And in other words, according to Karl Popper, you either have a theory that is false, or you have a theory that is not yet proven false. So Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is a critique of totalitarianism, advocating for an open liberal democracy. Of course, as we sit here today, one of the questions that we have to actually understand is historically, which were the enemies of the open society? Today, as we speak, as we sit here, who are the enemies of the open society? And ultimately, who shall be the enemies of society in the future? Of course, Karl Popper calls this historicism, where you use history in order to determine what is going to happen in the future. Popper criticizes several highly regarded intellectual giants such as Plato, Hegel, and Marx, regarding them as responsible for the 20th century totalitarianism. So what is totalitarianism? According to the Oxford Dictionary, totalitarianism is a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state, close quote. Another very influential philosopher, Hannah Arendt, whom we have already discussed one of her books, Eichmann in Jerusalem and the Banality of Evil, had this to say of totalitarianism, and I quote, "Before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such, for in the opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of man who can fabricate it." In this new era of post-truth and alternative truth, I think this issue of totalitarianism of the fourth industrial age becomes very important. So in a totalitarian state, the government controls all forms of power and all facets of life. The list of dictators overseeing totalitarian states in Europe is long. Germany had Adolf Hitler, the Führer, who was in a class of his own amongst dictators. He was, in effect, evil personified. There was Benito Mussolini, the douche in Italy. There was General Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator. All were fascists, which is a violent form of nationalism. According to Popper, the catalyst for these European dictators were the philosophies of Plato, Hegel, and Marx. In Asia, has been the Kim family in North Korea, the Suharto in Indonesia, and Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. Before the totalitarian era, countries were ruled by kings, lords, clergy, vassals, and fiefs, with the majority of the populace being de facto slaves in the forms of serfs. Plato is known for his ideas that philosophers should be kings. This is similar to the premise that I often advocate, that those who do not read should not lead. This idea has been so influential that in many countries, even up to today, politicians tend to be well educated. However, good philosophers are guided by the principle of seeking the truth at all expenses. In other words, there's no room for bending the truth in philosophy, whereas in politics, certainly in the politics of the fascist type, propaganda has been a tool for controlling people, especially in dictatorship. Immanuel Kant said, and I quote, that kings should become philosophers, or philosophers kings. It's not likely to happen, nor would it be desirable, since the position of power invariably debases the free judgment of reason. It is, however, indispensable that a king or a kingly, and that is self-ruling people, should not suppress philosophers, but leave them the right of public utterance. Therefore, the idea that a philosopher king can in any way lead to totalitarianism is far from reality. Hitler was an uneducated man. His book, Mein Kampf, is illogical, and the only coherent, although fallible aspect of it is its racist ideology and anti-Semitism. Hegel came up with what is known as Hegelian dialectics. The theory of dialectics actually goes back to Plato's teacher, the Greek philosopher Socrates. Reaching a conclusion based on a series of dialogues is called the Socratic Method. Hegel proposed three dialectic principles, which are the thesis, the antithesis, and a synthesis. The thesis and the antithesis are often contradictory and negate each other. This contradiction is resolved through the fusing of the thesis and the antithesis to create a synthesis. Marx, and that's Karl Marx, used Hegelian dialectics to analyze the French Revolution and develop the theory of historical materialism, which is at the core of this theory of historicism that is being critiqued in this book that we are talking about. For instance, in the Second French Revolution, there were those to the left referred to as the mountains, and those to the right referred to as the party of order. And of course, we know this idea of the party of order being misused by the US President Donald Trump against the Black Lives Matter protests. He says, if they don't go home, then the guns will, if there is rioting, then there will be gunshots. So, going back to the Second French Revolution. So, the mountains were actually the antithesis of the party of order. They were antagonistic and their values were contradictory over matters such as wealth from the right and jobs from the left. Here in South Africa, because of the difficulties of our economy, when we talk about issues of jobs, we often descend into the issue of xenophobia. They are taking away our jobs. It's one of the cries that we often hear. Of course, many of these are misused. They are misused for political aims, and we have to guard against certainly unguarded nationalism. So this contradiction between the mountains, and the party of order was actually resolved through the Second Revolution. And unfortunately, in both the First and the Second French Revolution, the outcome of the revolution was actually the dictatorship of the Napoleons, the uncle and the nephew. This trend was repeated in Russia when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, contradicted the excesses of the regime of Tsar Nicholas II. The synthesis of these two was the creation of the Soviet Union. History was repeating itself. Karl Marx, quoting Friedrich Engels, once said, "History repeats itself, first as a tragedy and second as a farce." And being South Africans, we can testify about history repeating itself many, many, many times over. Another example, in the Soviet Union, the contradiction between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky was resolved through the exile and murder of Trotsky. Trotsky, later on, when the promises, Trotsky was later murdered when he was in Mexico. And later on, when the promises of the communist utopia contradicted Stalin's Russia, a reign of terror was the instrument used to resolve the contradiction, resulting in the death of millions of people. In China, the contradiction between Mao's Chinese Communist Party and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang was resolved with the overthrow of the Kuomintang and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Going back to Stalin, if the Soviet Union was not ruled by Stalin, could Adolf Hitler have been defeated? I think this is the question that many people will continue to ask. It's actually a counterfactual because we don't really know what would have happened. So the communists in North Korea engaged in a war with the capitalists from the South. The synthesis was the division of Korea and the Kim family's dictatorial leadership on the recommendation of Stalin's henchman, Beria. The same pattern was repeated in Vietnam, where the Viet Cong and the capitalists fought each other as proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. The outcome was the establishment of Vietnam as we know it, and of course, the defeat, maybe the first defeat of the US Army by the Northern Vietnam War. To paraphrase Marx and Friedrich Engels, the outcomes of these revolutions was the dictatorship of the proletariat. The contradiction between the revolutionary objectives of Fidel Castro and the dictator Batista were resolved by the dictatorship of the Castro family. Why was the dictatorship of the proletariat been such an attractive political system? It is because it promises the abolition of exploitation of one class by another, something that is in many ways desirable. Unfortunately, professional revolutionaries end up as a dominant class that merely speaks of the classless society's doctrine and most often becomes dictators. The other enemy of the open society that emerged in the 20th century was the rise of Germany's Nazi ideology. Even though Hitler was not the founder of the Nazi Party, he was recruited and ultimately took it over. The rise of the Nazi Party came about because of the confluence of several factors, such as the punitive consequences of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, the prevailing racist culture, and the ideology of Nietzsche of the Uberman or Superman. Hitler took the German nation with his ideal of Aryan domination and industrialized genocide and led that society into the Dark Ages. His totalitarianism was not the result of the teachings of Marx or Hegel or Plato as Popper in this book purports. Far from it. If we come here to the African continent, we have also had our fair share of enemies of the open society. Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, mounted a military coup against Patrice Lumumba, a man driven by the desire to develop his country. Mobutu plundered this country, creating poverty and chaos. Uganda has also seen its share of dictators, the most violent of whom was Idi Amin. Idi Amin used to boast that there is freedom of speech, but not freedom after speech. This man was clearly the enemy of the open society. A series of dictators has ruled Nigeria, the most notorious being General Sani Abacha. Of course, many people will say Babangida, and so on and so forth. But Abacha killed Ken Saro-Wiwa in defiance of the advice of our own Nelson Mandela. All these dictators were corrupt. They were not interested in creating open societies, but in looting their countries for their personal benefit. So, Popper's book has been very influential. There are many problems that I have with Popper's book. He obviously, and he does not hide the fact that the book was written out of anger of what happened in the Second World War. Popper was a Jewish intellectual, and perhaps, and more likely, he lost his family members in the Holocaust. So he was angry. He was angry, but I think his criticism of Adolf Hitler and his regime were absolutely spot on. But his criticism of Marx, because Marx's idea was not to subjugate the people. His ideas were actually to eliminate poverty. Whether the mechanism that he proposed was effective or not is an issue for another debate. But you can't accuse him of seeking to impose dictatorship for its own sake. And this brings to the fore a very important principle. Bentham and Mill are big advocates of this: utilitarianism. Does the open society necessarily lead to the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people? Does the open society necessarily leads to the elimination of poverty? And China is a case in point. It is not necessarily, it's not an open society, but you can't take away the fact that China has actually lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Can you have an open society if people are hungry? Coming here to South Africa, we know about people who are given T-shirts to do all sorts of things simply because they are hungry. Can we actually be free to express ourselves if our most basic needs are not taken care of? In fact, some people are arguing that because even in open societies, you have people who are hungry, the people with more appropriate power and influence and close, certainly, free speech in a way in exchange for giving people jobs and so on and so forth. We know very well that some of the big conglomerates that exist today are above criticism by newspapers, by thinkers, for no other reason except the fact that everybody knows that these are powerful forces that can retaliate and cause quite a great deal of harm on individuals who have opposing views or views that threaten their interests. So Popper's book is a brilliant book. It's old. It was written in 1945. It has obviously inspired people such as George Soros to form the Open Society Foundation to promote democratic traditions all over the globe. The big question that we ought to ask ourselves as Africans is that, does the Open Society Foundation actually promote democratic traditions? Are there some vested interests, visible or invisible, that we cannot be able to see? Do they really believe in an open society? Or it is just a question of interests and the pursuit of interests at the expense of the concept of the open society? Of course, the open society ideas advocate democratic principles, which are good ideas, but they are not easy to construct and are ultimately never achieved, as we witnessed in Donald Trump's America at the beginning of the year, or in Brazil, or in many ways here in our own neighborhood in South Africa. As Winston Churchill put it, and I quote, democracy is not a perfect system, but it is the best we have. In the era of the fourth industrial revolution, the open society ideas are under threat, not from dictators, but not from dictatorship of the ruling political elites, but from the dictatorship of the techno-barons who can be able to influence our thinking and deny us information by feeding us so much information, much of it not true, in order to confuse and take away our rights to express ourselves. So what is happening now is that censorship is coming camouflage as information. And this is done by bombarding society with a large amount of information, much of it not true. If this is not managed well, it will lead to technology-made inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So what are some of the lessons that we can draw from this book? Firstly, we have to be determined in our pursuit of an open society, real open society, and mindful of those philosophies which subliminally undermine the concept of the open society. The second lesson is that we have to understand technology and its implications for freedom and democracy. Thirdly, we have to learn the history of the root cause of the rise of fascism, racism, genocides, etc., to protect future generations where they could be carried out with even greater efficiencies through the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So I thank you very much. Maria, you are muted.
Thank you so much, Prof. Marwala. Sorry about that. The questions are coming in thick and fast, and I'm going to start with a question which asks, could you explain the open society in more detail? And is totalitarianism equal to the loss of freedom?
Well, the open society obviously is a society where individuals are free to express themselves, to hold views, to employ the people who are going to govern them, you know. So the democratic ideals, more specifically, liberal democratic ideas. This is what the open society is all about. Now, on the issue of totalitarianism, can you just repeat that question?
Yeah, so is totalitarianism equal to the loss of freedom?
No, totalitarianism is by definition is equivalent to the loss of freedom, because totalitarianism basically is about, I'm going to tell you where you're going to live. I'm going to tell you whether you go to school or you're not going to go to school. I am going to tell you what you can say and what you can't say. So clearly, it is by definition, it results in the loss of freedom. Now, if we go back to Rousseau, the famous French philosopher Rousseau, he once said that as individuals, we give away our freedoms to a government in exchange for the government to obviously take care of our needs. So the question that you can ask is that in such a situation where we go to an election and we employ people who are going to determine how we are going to live our lives, are we really, really free? And that is why we have the Constitution. The Constitution is supposed to say, yes, there are things that any government will restrict a person from doing, you know. It goes without saying, you know, that you can't drive your car at a speed of 170 kilometers per hour. You know, you don't have that freedom to do that. We have to limit that freedom for you to do that, you know. But they decide that no, but there's this set of values that are so sacrosanct that no legislator can be able to take away from that. And that is where issues of human rights becomes very, very important. That those are unalienable rights that can be taken away from you, even by the government that you have elected.
So Prof. Marwala, I'm then going to go to a question that I think leads on to what you've just said. And this is around COVID and the regulations from government. So with COVID and how it is managed, can we actually have an open society? Does the government not at the moment dictate our behavior and take away our rights to work?
No, absolutely, absolutely, you know. I mean, I actually think that we ought to now interrogate this idea of an open society. And obviously, we are at a university. And one of the sacrosanct aspects of a good university is actually freedom of speech, academic freedom. Academic freedom is actually a very important aspect of certainly the University of Johannesburg. That not necessarily mean that you don't have world-class universities that would not have the same type of academic freedom as we do, and so on and so forth. Now, let's come to COVID. Now, this is really utilitarianism now. You basically look at the situation and say, we have to pursue that which will result in the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. Now, if I go around town not wearing a mask, perhaps I'm COVID-19, yes, I will have my freedom to walk around without my mask. But in that process, I am going to infect people, and very likely I'm going to kill people. Is that the kind of open society that we desire? No. So open society must always be checked against the harm that openness is going to do to the greatest number of people. You always have to check it. The same thing with driving at the 180 kilometers per hour. It's not as dangerous as being COVID positive and going to a mall, but it is dangerous. You can knock somebody on the road, you can get into an accident and kill somebody, and so on and so forth, specifically because of the harm that behavior is going to do. Then we have to limit that openness in that situation.
Right, thank you for that answer. The next question is, to what extent can this very profound book offer solutions to South Africa's most prevalent problem? The problem being African leaders clinging to power syndrome, which many African scholars have vehemently opposed.
You see, yeah, I mean, this is the problem of governance. This is the problem of democracy, because it also happens in countries which hold democratic elections. I always say that I can excuse it for a military dictatorship, because there you have a madman who gets hold of a gun and he holds everybody at gunpoint. So the people there's nothing they're victims, But in a democratic society where people actually can go to an election and vote, and of course the vote can be manipulated, obviously, in that case I can excuse, But in a country where you can actually go and vote, and your vote is going to be counted once you get that outcome, then there is no other person to blame than the people who are doing the voting. As somebody once said, that the beauty of democracy is that people actually get the government that they deserve. If they are woke, they're going to get a government that is woke. If they are slippish, they're going to become victims of people who are going to exploit the fact that they are slippish to put forward their own personal agenda. Now, let's look at Southern Africa, because that is where the question is. And we shouldn't even go very, very far. Let's look at a country where I can see while I stand in the part of South Africa where I come from, Zimbabwe. something has gone wrong. No doubt about it, something has gone wrong. It is a democratic country. Some people might say no, not all the votes are counted. You go to villages, school teacher comes and say, I cannot read and write. Can you put a cross on my ballot box? Because he knows that if he does not show how he's going to vote, he might actually be in trouble at the end of the day. How do we fix that? That is the question, especially of the younger member of our society. That is your issue to resolve. That is the issue to resolve, because the situation as is cannot continue. Then let us look at the outcome of governance, because governance must actually lead. Good governance must actually lead to the reduction of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And here in South Africa, poverty is rife. Here in South Africa, unemployment is 32%. And some people are saying unofficially it's 35%. Inequality is rife. How are we going to untangle that? Is the open society a key to unlock that? And I believe that the way you can untangle that is to educate the population. An uneducated population cannot truly be living in an open society.
So linked to this is another question, Prof. Marwala, you quote Churchill that democracy is not a perfect system, but the best we have. Do you agree with this statement, and why?
I agree with this statement, obviously, simply because the outcomes are varying. I must confess, I do admire what the Chinese society has achieved as far as poverty is concerned. I do admire the infrastructure that I see when I visit the People's Republic of China. It makes New York looks like a squatter camp. So the question is, and I once asked a friend of mine when I was at Cambridge, who was from China, doing a postdoc. And I said, tell me, my good friend, how about democracy? He looks at me and says, but people don't eat democracy. I was puzzled a little bit, about that statement. I'm trying to still figure out what he really meant by that statement. Almost 23 years later, I'm still trying to pass. He says, no, that people don't eat democracy, But it is clear that it is not a perfect system, because it can produce leaders who are not acting at the best interest of their population. We have seen it. We don't even have to look, We have seen it time and time again in Brazil. Donald Trump is a classic example. Some of the leaders, in fact, even if we go to the examples that Popper actually talks about, Adolf Hitler, the Nazi power, the Nazi regime actually came through a democratic process. That's what people don't know. That is what people do not actually realize. That in 1933, when they came into power, it was because of a ballot. They did not get the majority. They got the highest vote. They got the highest vote, and they went and formed the government. And of course, they went on and abolished the very institution that brought them into power. So in that system, the system of getting government through a ballot, if it can be able to give us, for example, the Nazism, then clearly it can't be an ideal system. It only becomes ideal when we are vigilant, when we are informed, so that we can make the correct decisions and hold the people that we elect to account.
Right, Prof. Marwala, now I have another question on quite a different track. Plato wrote The Republic and is often held as a very important philosopher. Could you give us a deeper understanding of why Popper is critical of Plato?
Well, I mean, look, let me just give you one of the principles that philosophers should be rulers. Philosophers should be rulers. I know here we have Mandla Khadewe who takes special interest in this topic. And when the Bolsheviks came into power in the Soviet Union, they took that idea very, very seriously in the implementation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there are these people, you can call them the professional class, you can call them the name just the shadow. If you go to the former Soviet Union, you always had the commissars, the political commissars, who are the philosophers. These are the philosophers who are looking to make sure that whoever, whether you are the vice chancellor, and I have been to countries where there's a vice chancellor and the chairman of the secretary of the Communist Party who looks at what the vice chancellor is doing, because that is the philosopher who makes sure that you are doing what you are supposed to do. The vanguards, they even use words like vanguards. So clearly that idea, is more. It was implemented. Is probably part of Marxist Leninist, one of the tenets of Marxist Leninism. Directly actually flows from Plato, and it is not necessarily in line with an open society.
Okay, then the next question goes back to something you were talking about a few minutes ago, and that is, Prof. Marwala, you often speak in favor of China. Having read Karl Popper, how worried are you about the political and economic rise of China and its dictatorial leadership?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not one of those people who are very worried about it. I think there are many excellent attributes of that China has actually achieved. Yes, some of the positive things that many people in my village will benefit from also has a negative aspect. I mean, one of the positive things about the rise of China is cheap goods. We take it for granted that in the 80s to buy a pair of shoes was very expensive. Today, you can go and get a cheap shoe, because of access production from China. It's good. Because now when you go to villages, you see people, and it's not only in South Africa, you go to Zimbabwe, you go to Mozambique, see people wearing these cheap Chinese goods, Of course, the disadvantage of that is that what happens to our ability to produce our own goods if the Chinese can be able to produce it at a cheaper price. Now, when it comes to the issue of democracy, by the way, they call their system democratic centralism. They call their system democratic centralism. So I wouldn't want to be judgmental. I think there are many, many excellent things that China has done for its own population. So I will leave it at that.
Sorry. And the next question is, philosophy without science is mental speculation. Similarly, totalitarianism is transactional, then transformational leadership. VC, is utilitarian approach implementary to our political economic transformation? VC, is utilitarian approach complementary to our political economic transformation? If yes, how?
Oh, absolutely, it is, because utilitarianism is about producing more goods, producing more jobs. It's about having a bigger economy, making sure that the sick have hospitals to go to, and so on and so forth. So as a concept, the idea that you have to pursue that which is useful for your population, for as many people in your population as possible, is very, very important. Now, you are asking a much more difficult question. Your question is really, is utilitarianism, is our transformational agenda actually stifling productivity or stifling economic growth and so on and so forth? I don't think it does. I actually think that if transformation is implemented well, and you bring those women into the workplaces, you bring those women into the leadership, you bring that diversity of people, the African people, into our industries, I believe that it will lead to abundance, it will lead to increase in competitiveness, it will lead into the expansion of our economy, so that we can be able to use that in order to take care of our people.
Thanks, Prof. Marwala. The next question is also a nuanced question. It says, I like that philosophers must be rulers, because the president who passed the Group Areas Act in South Africa had sociology, philosophy, and journalism as expertise. So that spoke to society and
who has done very well in the tests, but has no ethics, then you're going to